The Basics of Photography. Classification, Unclassified. Presented by me, Corporal Tyler Brock. I am the Assistant UPAR for the 1st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division in Colorado at Fort Carson. I was a photojournalist for 3.5 years before I joined the Army. I also have an associate's degree in photojournalism, and I also was borrowed military manpower over at the 4th Infantry Division Public Affairs Office, where I learned DoD standards for public affairs. If you want to learn more about my bio, learn more about me, my bio will be linked in the description below. Overview. In this introduction to photography, we will break down the elements of a proper exposure or an image. We will also look at how to understand your camera and how it perceives the world around it. In addition, we will also look at the tools you as a photographer are given to adjust and perceive the light around you. Keep in mind, the key word there is light. The objectives. At the end of this lesson, you will have a basic understanding of what photography is, while also being able to manually adjust your camera to give you a proper exposure. The student should have a basic understanding of the tools that they can utilize to correct and shape light. Before going any further, I would like to go over the 3 concepts of photography. Now, these aren't set in stone, and this is how I perceive photography. Others may perceive it different ways, but this is how I look at it. You have, like I said, 3 concepts: the mechanics, visual storytelling, and presentation. The mechanics, which is what we're going to get into today, which is exactly what this lesson is the basics of photography. So understanding how to utilize light, how to utilize your camera to create a proper exposed image. And so before you move into storytelling and presentation, you need to understand the mechanics. Many people today think if you get a nice camera, nice equipment, whatever, that you can take great images. No, that is wrong. Just because you have a great camera, great lenses, great tripod, whatever, the nicest lights, it does not mean that you're a great photographer. How you use those tools is what makes you a great photographer, and how you understand those tools, how you understand the camera and how it works. So that's basically what this lesson is understanding the mechanics of photography, the basics of photography. Wherever there is light, one can photograph. Alfred Stieglitz. I would encourage you to look up who Alfred Stieglitz was. He was very influential in photography in the early years, and he basically modernized photography. He was a giant in the photographic and art world. So what is photography? Photography is the art of painting with light. It's a cheesy saying that many photographers say, but it's true. The light is your paintbrush, and wherever that light touches is what you expose for your image. So anywhere there is light, you can photograph. Merriam-Webster's definition of photography is the art or process of producing images by the action of radiant energy and especially light on a sensitive surface, such as film or an optical sensor. You can use light to make an image, but that last part of the definition, you need some way of recording that light. So we'll dive more into that in the next slide. So what is the equation to make an image? And this is the equation: light plus time equals an exposure. So light is relative to the size and distance of your subject. I'm not going to try to overcomplicate this, and I'm not going to try to extend the slide any longer. Okay, so time is how long your camera records light. And yes, you can determine that. And we'll get more into that later, the next slide. Your exposure. This is where that film or optical sensor comes into play. It requires some type of object to absorb the light over an amount of time. This is your sensor, or in the old days, film. So basically, I think of it as like a sponge. You need some sort of sponge to record that image. Even back in the early years of photography, there was a camera called the camera obscura. And basically what it was a box with a hole in it, and it projected the outside world onto what's called a ground glass. And so basically it would project that light, the image, onto that ground glass. And you would take a piece of paper, or some people even made them into like a building, like a shed. And they would have a piece of paper that light would project on. And they would take a pencil or a pen or a paintbrush or whatever, and they would trace over the projected image. So therefore they were recording the light. It may not be how you and I perceive recording light, but they were recording the image. The exposure triangle. Your camera uses 3 elements as depicted here in this picture. The 3 sides of this triangle. You have ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. I won't read through this slide word for word because I know that you can do that, but I will explain it this way. ISO controls how sensitive your sensor is, and basically the higher the ISO is, the more noise you let into your image. And by noise, I mean graininess in your image, and it doesn't look great, but sometimes you just can't get around it, and you have to. But understanding the higher the number is, the more sensitive your sensor will be for letting in that light onto the sensor. Your shutter speed, basically in your camera you have a curtain, and that curtain is your shutter. And so the curtain opens and closes, and this is the time that your shutter speed can open and close. So you have very fast and very slow, and so in that amount of time you're going to record light or motion or whatever. So the faster your shutter speed is, the more likely you are to freeze motion, and the slower your shutter speed, the longer it's open, the blurrier your image is going to be, because it's capturing the motion of what's going on, if that makes sense at all. So that's shutter speed. And then you have aperture. Aperture is, as you can see here in the picture, it's how wide your lens is opened. So you see f2.8, it's as wide as that lens will probably open. And then you have f22, and that's as small as that lens supposedly will close. Some will close smaller and some will open up bigger. It just depends on the lens. But that's the prime apertures. And also keep in mind, all of these are prime numbers. So your ISO, that's prime. Your shutter speed, that is prime. And how it's measured is stops of light. So if you ever hear someone say, close down your lens 3 stops, and you're at f4, well, that means that you need to close down to f11. And then if you hear someone say you need to slow your shutter speed down by 7 stops, well, you need to count down 7 stops on your prime shutter speeds. And then your ISO, same thing. If they say that you need to increase by 2 stops your ISO, well, that's how you measure it. Each of these are stops. Now, different cameras have, in between numbers in between there. So like, 1/25th to 2/50th of a second in your shutter speed, there could be a shutter speed of 200. Well, those aren't your primes. You can go between those, and we'll explain how to do that. But essentially, these are your primes, and I would encourage you to memorize them because it'll help you understand a thing called reciprocity, which is a little complicated to explain over a slide. And so if you ever want to get with me, I can teach you. So you're probably wondering how you utilize this exposure triangle to create a properly exposed image. Well, as you adjust your ISO or your shutter speed or your aperture, you need to compensate somewhere else. So if your image is properly exposed and you bring your ISO down 3 stops, well, you're going to have to either bring up your aperture 3 stops, or you're going to have to bring up your shutter speed up 3 stops. Or you can split it between the two. So understanding that you can't change something within the exposure triangle without having to change another aspect of that triangle to get a properly exposed image. They all work together in unison. So measuring light. Again, I'm not going to read this slide word for word, but keep in mind those stops of light, the stops, and your shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. You can use what is called an exposure meter, and what your exposure meter does is it measures light for you. And you can measure this in two different types of ways. You have incident and reflective. Incident is taking exposure reading from the subject to your camera, and then a reflective is taking an exposure meter reading from your camera to the subject. So the incident reading, it's measuring light that is falling on the subject, and your reflective is measuring light that is bouncing off of your subject. Both have their place, and both are great to use and to know. Every circumstance is different. For example, incident exposure meter is good when you actually have time to do it. So like if you're doing a portrait and you have lights, like a flash, that's when it's good to use. However, reflective, sometimes, like for me, for example, as a photojournalist, sometimes I didn't have time to get an exposure meter reading, and I had to use my reflective meter inside of my camera, which brings me to the next point. The bottom right image, as you can see where it says camera internal exposure meter, cameras have their own exposure meter inside of them. And if you shoot in manual mode or aperture mode or shutter speed priority mode, you can control, or ISO priority mode, forgot about that one, sorry. You can control your aperture or your shutter speed or your ISO manually. But every time you change it, you're going to see your exposure meter changing, telling you whether you're underexposed or overexposed. To the left, where you see the minus, the negatives numbers, that means that you're underexposed. The plus means that you're overexposed. And theoretically, you should keep your reading in the middle. But some cameras are different. Like for example, my camera does better if it's anywhere from 1.5 stops to 2 stops underexposed. And my other camera, it's just the opposite. It does better if it's half a stop overexposed. So it's different. Even from manufacturers to different camera models, it's totally different. Even though those cameras came off the same assembly line, it can be different. So that's when it's important for you to take time to work with your camera to understand how it works and its little quirks, you could say. So We'll get into overexposed and underexposed in the next few slides. Okay, so we'll start understanding how your camera sees the world. Oftentimes you might have noticed that if you shoot in auto mode on your camera, it does a pretty good job of properly exposing your image. Well, this is why. Middle or 18% gray. 18% gray, as you can see on the gradient chart here, 18% gray is in the exact middle of that gradient. And so basically what your camera does is it looks at the world around it and it says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this image or the area where it's metering, which we'll get into metering areas here in just a minute. But it's looking at the area that you're metering and it's saying, okay, I need to turn that area into 18% gray. So what it does is it will either overexpose your highlights or underexpose your highlights, or vice versa with your shadows, overexpose your shadows or underexpose your shadows to make it 18% gray. And so the idea, what it's trying to do is it's trying to make it to where you can still get details out of your shadows, but then also still get details out of your highlights. It's trying to make it all properly exposed. Now, it's not wrong. It's what it was created to do. However, you are smarter than your camera. Metering modes, I won't go into much detail of this, but I cannot stress it enough. Read your camera manual. Get the book out and read it. And if you can't find the book, go online, look up the PDF for it. Most manufacturer websites have it. Not only for the metering, but also just to understand how your camera works and understand where your functions are and how to access things in your camera. It's very important. Now, when it comes to metering modes, every camera manufacturer is different, and even camera models are different from each other. Like my D850, how to pull up a histogram is different from how to pull up on my D3S. And so I never would have understood how to do that unless I would have read the manual. So understanding your metering. Since I know Nikon, I'll break it down with Nikon. So if you look at that, you have matrix, center weighted, and spot. All these are your metering systems. And so matrix metering system basically reads the whole entire frame from corner to corner, from edge to edge, from top to bottom. It measures the whole entire image and it tells you what you need to do to make that image 18% gray. Going back to your metering system and going back to the gradient chart. Then you have your center weighted metering, and that's it's sort of like spot metering, the one below it. However, it measures just a little bit outside of that. I can't remember the amount of, like, the distance outside of that spot that it measures, but it's not huge. And I'll tell you, I usually shoot in center weighted. It usually does pretty well for me. Matrix sometimes is just too flat for me, and spot is just not enough area for me to get an exposure metering on there. Spot, like I said, is just a small point within the image that it measures. So histogram, I mentioned this earlier, but histogram can save your life. Every camera should have a histogram. If it doesn't, I would take it back. But as far as the histogram, I'm not going to go into detail about. I'm not going to read the slide word for word again. But as you can see, on the left is the unedited image, and then on the right is the edited image, and then the image below that looks like a graph. That is the histogram. And as you can see how I've marked it, to the left is underexposed, to the right is overexposed. The idea for your image is that you want to keep all of your data, so that graph, you want to keep it all within the histogram. You don't want it going outside of it, or you just don't want to go into the left or the right outside of it. If you do, you have you lose data. So if you're to the right overexposed, then you're losing your shadow details. And then if you're, your highlight details. And then if you're going to the left, you're losing your highlight details, or your shadow details. Sorry. I'll go into more detail about that and show you. But anyway, the idea with that is, as you can see with my unedited image, it's not great. My shadows are pretty dark. My highlights are pretty underexposed. So it seems like an underexposed image. However, if you look at the histogram, it's telling you I have data within my entire image. And then once I brought up the exposure in Photoshop, you can see how the edited image brought up the shadow details, and then the highlights weren't overexposed. So that's why you trust your histogram when you're doing this, and you trust your metering system. However, you also know how much your metering and histogram differ. So going back to how I have to photograph sometimes underexposed on my camera, knowing that will help you. And again, refer to your manual to find out where your histogram is. Like I said, it can save your life. So these are examples of under and overexposed images. I had to go into Photoshop and alter these a little bit, so they are edited, but it's to show you what the histogram would look like if your image is overexposed. As you can see in the overexposed image on the left, you can look at the histogram, and a lot of the data is just going off of the histogram. That is data that I've lost. So like if you want to think about it as the sky, I could not pull details out of the sky because the highlights are too overexposed. On the opposite side of that is the underexposed. I've got some detail going out. There's some data going to the left outside of the histogram, as you can see. So I would not be able to pull that data out from my shadows. There would be no information, no detail that I could pull from my shadows. So again, I'm going to go back to the first one. Make sure your histogram is within, the data is within to your left and right limits. All right, so let's put it all together in a conclusion. Utilizing the exposure triangle, you can manipulate and alter the image or your exposure. The photographer gets to determine what the image looks like, not the camera. Please do not forget that. A photographer can capture more properly exposed images by understanding how the camera sees the world. Histograms are used to help photographers understand whether they have a properly exposed image or not. This concludes the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tyler.w.brock2.mil@army.mil. I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.